This is Sustainability Forward with Wrishi and Carmine.
Hello and welcome to Sustainability Forward. I am your host, Rishi, and my co-host Carmine is with me. How are you, Carmine?
Good, Richie. How is it going?
It's going very well. Carmine, today's episode is about the ongoing war in the Middle East. But because there has been a lot of commentary already about the geopolitical situation there, we are taking a slightly different take on it. What we want to do is ask a more specific question, which is around what does this war reveal about the systems that keep modern life running? And more importantly, what does it mean for clean energy, water, and a whole set of overlooked but critical commodities going around the world?
So looks like a very interesting topic. So we're trying to go beyond the hydrocarbons, the oil and gas, because this conflict has exposed how much vulnerable the entire economies are. Not just on these resources, but the whole infrastructure and supply chain that is built around them.
Yeah, the war began approximately a month ago, and already it has been described as the largest disruption to the global oil market history. The numbers are staggering: 25, 30% of global oil, 20% of LNG that normally moves through the Strait of Hormuz. And also the IEA has taken a very, very unprecedented step of releasing or planning to release 400 million barrels of emergency stock, which is quite unprecedented in history. There is a reason why we see the oil headlines, but that's just for some context around this problem.
This tells you that is not just a resource-driven story. It's a resilience story. This is about whether countries can keep home powered, water flowing, fertilizer moving, semiconductor plants operating, and the food systems functioning when a single region becomes unstable.
Yes. And today we are going to look at this through three lenses so we get a holistic view on it. First is obvious, energy, and why renewables are increasingly being seen not just as tools to address climate change, but as tools for energy security. Second, we will look at water, especially the relationship between desalination, electricity, and resilience in one of the driest parts of the world, which is the Middle East. And third, everything beyond oil, and really one of the biggest chunks of this challenge. It includes commodities like fertilizer, helium, and the less visible materials that become strategic when a conflict like this disrupts the system.
This third point really matters because there is the danger in this conversation that we reduce what's happening in the Middle East just to a resource map.
Yeah.
But modern economies, they run much more than the oil and gas. The water is showing us how deep these interdependencies are.
Yeah. So let's start with the obvious one, the first one, which is energy. I think the clearest insight from this war is that renewables are gaining a new kind of political relevance, not just because they cut carbon, which is really obvious, but because they reduce exposure to geopolitical fuel shocks.
So, and this is a very different framing. For years in the energy trilemma, the renewables are often been focusing on one of the three topics, on the emission reduction, climate target, air pollution. And these are still valid arguments, valid goals. But this conflict is doing, what it's doing is elevating a much harder edge argument, security.
Yeah. The CERA week concluded in Houston just a few days ago, and a number of energy executives and policymakers are now openly saying that this conflict could accelerate investment in renewables, not because of climate anxiety, but because of security concerns. There was a blunt comment around wind plus solar plus batteries becoming not only economically viable, but becoming a major energy security option.
And this is saying us something important. What people value is not just low cost, it's reliability, domestic control, and insulation from global volatility, so security.
Yes, I heard about the example of South Korea. Reuters mentions that South Korea sources about 70% of its oil from the Middle East. 26 of these vessels destined for South Korea were stuck in the Persian Gulf, and the country is now putting in place some emergency fiscal measures to cushion the impact of this shock. The president of South Korea framed this crisis as a reason to move towards a more sustainable energy system with a strong emphasis on renewables.
And that is a story of one country, but it reflects something broader. So if you are a resource importing nation, this war is basically an object lesson in vulnerability. The more your economy depends on third parties and it goes across a narrow contested shipping route, the more exposed you are.
Yeah, and this is not only the story of East Asia. Closer to home here in Europe, gas prices have jumped up more than 70% since the war started. Energy ministers in the EU are now coordinating their response and focusing on filling gas storage systems early, stabilizing product markets, and trying to avoid fragmented national reactions.
And this brings us also to a very interesting contrast. If your system relies heavily on imported resources, on commodities, and you are at risk of shortages, it's one kind of story. If your system relies more on solar, wind, on manufacturing things related to electrification, for example, you're still not immune, but your exposure is very different.
Correct. Renewables do not make geopolitics disappear. We know that much. But they do change what you are dependent on. Once a solar farm or wind project is built, its marginal fuel cost is basically zero. It is not repriced every time a tanker route is threatened, as it is happening right now with oil and LNG.
So this volatility looks quite serious. So Reuters, citing Barclays, said that a prolonged disruption could imply a supply loss from 13 to 14 million barrels per day versus the total global demand of around 100 million barrels per day this year. This is quite big. Barclays also called this the biggest geopolitical shock to energy markets since the 1990 Gulf War.
So the key question is, if you are a policymaker or a utility or an industrial buyer, what do you take from that? You take away the idea that clean power is not just green power, it is partially de-risked power.
And this is why I think this work will have a lasting effect on the energy politics and the policies. Because the energy security broadens the coalition, for example, on clean energy. You don't need to look at it just from one angle, from the climate ideology. You just need to agree that repeated shocks are economically and strategically painful and how to manage that.
Yeah, I also think psychology matters a lot here. We've now had two major energy system shocks in 2022 with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and now this one with Iran. At some point, people stop seeing these as isolated incidents and start seeing them as structural features of the system.
So the focus goes to how much geopolitical risk are we willing to carry in the current system?
Yeah. Now, we have to be honest here. There is a built-in sort of inherent short-term contradiction. In the immediate aftermath of a crisis like this, some countries fall back on coal or other high emission fuels because they're scrambling for whatever is available to keep them going.
And that's important to acknowledge because otherwise the conversation becomes too neat. In the short run, conflict can absolutely make the energy mix dirtier.
But the long run lesson can still be in support of clean energy. In fact, the short run pain may reinforce it. If imported fuels become expensive, scarce, or politically risky, then over time, the value of domestic, renewable, electrified systems tends to rise.
This is where the energy security and the climate strategy start to converge. Not perfectly, not instantly, but increasingly.
Yeah. So if we kind of summarize this first segment on energy in one line, it would be this. The current Middle East war is helping turn renewables from a climate preference into a strategic necessity.
It is a very different level of importance in the broader way of telling the story about energy transition.
That's right. So, shall we move to water?
Yes.
So, because this is the part of the story that I think many listeners may not have thought through that much, that's why we're going to spend some time talking about the threat that is linked to water as a result of this war.
Yeah, because this crisis has made something very visible. In much of the Gulf, water security depends on electricity security, and both can be threatened at the same time.
Yeah. AP reported this week that there were a number of threats explicitly linked to bombing of desalination plants and analysts warning that there could be retaliation from the other side, doing the same to desalination plants of other countries. That may sound like an obscure infrastructure. After all, what is a desalination plant? But it is not. In several Gulf countries, desalination is the backbone of daily life.
Yeah, looking at the same report you mentioned, we see that, for example, 90% of drinking water in Kuwait comes from desalination, 86% in Oman, 70% in Saudi Arabia. And other analysis showing us that more than 90% of Gulf desalination water comes from just 56 plants, each of them highly vulnerable in terms of security.
Yeah, let's just let that sink in. More than 90% of the Gulf's desalinated water coming from just 56 plants. That is an extraordinary concentration of risk.
And there is another crucial point. Many of these desalination plants are tied to power station. So as you said, to energy, to electricity. It's a power water nexus story. If electricity goes down, water can be disrupted. If coastal infrastructure is damaged, you get simultaneous stress across both systems.
Yeah, and there is historical precedent for it as well. During the Iraq's 1990-91 invasion of Kuwait, power stations and desalination plants were sabotaged, and Kuwait was left largely without fresh water, relying on emergency imports. And the full recovery from that took years. And that is not hypothetical history. It is a real example of how conflict can turn, infrastructure vulnerability into a humanitarian crisis.
So where the clean energy angle then come in the story?
Yeah, it comes from the question of decoupling. If water supply is too dependent on centralized, fossil-heavy, fragile power systems, then one response is to redesign the relationship. Clean electricity, more efficient desalination, more distributed power, more storage, and more backup provides more resilience.
And the region is already under pressure even without this crisis. So the International Energy Agency reported last year that the electricity demand across the Middle East and North Africa is surging, driven heavily by cooling and desalination. He said that around 40% of projected increase in electricity demand over the next decade is expected to come from these two needs alone: air conditioning and water desalination.
It's a very important statistic. 40% of the increase in demand coming from cooling and desalination. So when people talk about energy transition in the region, they often jump straight to exports, hydrogen or big industrial strategy. But actually, one of the most urgent issues is much more fundamental. Can the region build electricity systems that are resilient enough to support water security in a hotter, drier, and more volatile future?
And this crisis is kind of wake-up call, because it reveals that the water infrastructure is not just a separate humanitarian category, a utility. It's deeply embedded in the energy system design.
Now, it's also true that desalination has its own sustainability challenges. It is energy intensive. It can be carbon intensive. It creates brine discharge issues about which we've talked in previous episodes. So it's quite clear that desalination plants are highly energy intensive and emit large amounts of carbon while being vulnerable to extreme weather and rising sea levels.
So the answer is not simply more desalination. The answer is better desalination, cleaner desalination, and more resilient desalination.
Right, and more intelligently integrated systems, reverse osmosis, renewable power desalination, energy storage, demand management, backup reservoirs. These are not just side issues anymore. They're basic security related issues.
And this is one of the important things from this episode, I think, on how we rethink the link between the energy, the power generation, and the clean and the water part, and how resilient and interconnected the two systems are.
Yeah, because if electricity fails, people are uncomfortable. If water fails, people are essentially in danger.
Yeah, exactly.
And the concentration of risk is also not trivial. Smaller states like Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait have fewer backup supplies than some of their neighbors, even though countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE have invested more in pipelines, storage reservoirs, and redundancy. That unevenness matters during the time of conflict like this.
It also matters politically because once water infrastructure is perceived as vulnerable, governments have stronger incentives to support more resilient form of power supply.
Yeah. And that, again, is the theme running through today's episode. This conflict may accelerate parts of the transition, less because governments suddenly become greener, and more because they became aware of fragility.
So, boiling down this second segment in one sentence, this crisis is exposing that in the Gulf, clean power and clean water are no longer separate conversation, but very linked together.
Yeah, and once this is seen, it's hard to unsee it. So now, Carmine, let's move to the third and probably one of the most important parts of the story, which is everything people don't usually think about when they think about the Middle East.
Yes, the hidden commodities, because this crisis is not only disrupting the resource part, natural resources, it's also affecting supply chains on fertilizers, helium, and other industrial inputs that sit much deeper in our economies.
Yeah, starting with fertilizer. There was a Reuters report covering this very closely, and the implications are huge. It is said that the Strait of Hormuz carries some 30% of globally traded fertilizers. Another reported that more than 30% of global nitrogen fertilizer supplies, including urea and sulfur, pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Bank of America warned that the conflict threatens 65 to 75% of global urea supplies. I think some sources indicate that prices are already up by 30 to 40%.
And that immediately takes us from energy security to food security, because fertilizer is not a niche commodity. Reuters notes that fertilizers support around half of the globe's food production. So when that supply chain is disrupted, the consequences don't stop at firm input cost. They are global.
Yeah, and we are already seeing that pressure. It is reported that US prices for some fertilizers were up by as much as 32%. Middle Eastern urea prices had surged by 40%. And in Ukraine, officials were talking about 30 to 35% increases in fertilizer, with urea up 65% since January. So significant increases all across the board.
Which is why this conflict is being described as fresh food price risk for vulnerable countries. And it's been reported that in many emerging countries, food and fuel make from 30 to 50% of consumer spending. So this kind of shocks really matters.
Yeah. And there's also a structural point here. Fertilizer is both shipping dependent and gas dependent. Nitrogen fertilizer relies heavily on natural gas as feedstock. So when war disrupts gas infrastructure and maritime routes at the same time, fertilizer gets squeezed twice.
Now, this opens up an interesting link to clean energy, because if countries and companies want to reduce the kind of vulnerability, one path is not just diversifying the trade routes, but also developing lower risk form of ammonia and fertilizer production, including routes tied to renewable power over time.
Exactly. This is where the conversation starts to move beyond replace oil with solar and into how do we build industrial systems that are less hostage to fossil fuel and choke point risk.
So let's bring the helium part, the helium story now, because this is one of those commodities most people never think about until there is suddenly a shortage.
Yeah. Reuters reported recently that disruptions to Qatar's gas processing had driven helium spot prices to double since the crisis began. That matters because helium is extracted as a byproduct of natural gas processing. So if LNG output is disrupted, helium supply is disrupted too.
And Qatar is not a minor player here. Without dipping into the number, let's think about that almost 1/3 of world supply is coming from there.
Wow, that's an extraordinary concentration for such a critical mineral. And just to tell our audience what uses helium: MRI machines, semiconductor manufacturing, aerospace, scientific equipment, sectors that are central to both healthcare and advanced industry. South Korea's chip makers have enough helium inventory for now, but they are paying premiums to secure supply. And the government sees helium and bromine as among key materials at risk if the conflict persists.
And so even in this story, we see as a conflict is impacting supply chains, choke points, and this can suddenly becomes a semiconductor story, a medical image story, an AI infrastructure story risk.
And if you're listening to this from the outside or from outside the energy world, that's the key message. Commodity interdependence means a conflict that begins with tankers and terminals can end up affecting farms, hospitals, and chip fabrication facilities.
So we talk about fertilizer and helium. There is also discussion about disruption of petrochemicals and plastics, because we have more than 40%, for example, of global polyethylene export in 2025 that is coming from the Middle East, and pricing surging as supplies tighten. So the wider point is the region has a significant that goes beyond resources, but also industrial.
Which is why I think the third segment changes the way we talk about resilience. It is not enough to say we need more energy security, the more complete statement should be we need cleaner, more diversified, less geographically concentrated supply systems across energy and industry.
And the reason clean energy matters here is that it can reduce exposure at multiple levels. It can lower dependence on resources. It can support domestic industrial electrification. It can eventually underpin new routes for producing inputs like ammonia. And it can make economies less vulnerable to knockout effect on these disruptions.
Yeah. So in that sense, this conflict is broadening the clean transition conversation. It's no longer just about decarbonizing the grid. It's about building economies that are less brittle.
And this will be one of the most durable legacies about what we're living today.
Okay, now, as we are approaching the end of this episode, let's step back and connect the dots. We started with energy, where the war is sharpening the case for renewables, storage, and electrification as tools of national security. We then moved to water, where the conflict is exposing how vulnerable desalination-dependent systems are when power and water infrastructure are tightly coupled. And finally, we looked at other commodities, including fertilizer, helium, and hidden communities, as we call them, where the conflict-driven disruption is rippling into agriculture, into healthcare, semiconductors, and even manufacturing, sectors that we didn't think were getting disrupted immediately after the war.
And the common trend is fragility. Linked to centralized systems, we talk about long supply chains, choke points, dependence on natural resources, heavy concentration in few facilities of countries. We talk about risk.
Which leads to a bigger idea. Maybe the transition we are talking about is not just an energy transition. Maybe it is a resilience transition.
It's an interesting framing because it captures something that climate language sometimes misses. For some audiences, resilience is more probably understandable, easier to digest. It speaks to security, sovereignty, affordability, continuity, readiness.
Yeah, and the war in the Middle East is making that framing hard to ignore. The IMF has already warned that the shock is global, though asymmetric, and that poorer countries are especially at risk from higher food and fertilizer prices. The G7 has said it is ready to take all the necessary measures for energy and market stability. The IEA again has made its largest ever emergency stock release of crude oil. These are not small or marginal signals. They tell you policymakers see this as systemic.
And as you also mentioned before, Rishi, there are some nuances here. All the discussion does not automatically follow that every government will respond by accelerating energy transition. Some may double down on short-term fossil backup. There is the dimension of time, there is the dimension of the inertia of the energy systems.
That's right. So the argument is not that the war neatly and immediately helps the transition. That's not what we are saying in this episode. The argument here is that the war exposes the strategic weaknesses of the existing system, and in doing so, improves the long-term case for clean, electrified, and diversified alternatives.
Maybe the most important distinction to this episode, there are also what we said before, there are reaction in short term versus long-term direction.
Short term, the picture can be messy, higher fossil prices, temporary coal fallback, emergency subsidies, panic buying, supply scrambling.
And in long term, the lesson may be very clear. Countries rely on important natural resources, probably less building stronger grids, link clean energy to water security, diversify critical inputs, and likely to better position in a world where this disruption is not so rare.
Yeah, and that the world does not feel theoretical anymore.
So, Rishi, let's then wrap up. I think it has been a very interesting episode. My takeaway probably first, we see governments start now being more explicit about framing the energy transition with a security part. It was interesting to look at the water resilience, especially in the desalination and linked to clean power. And third, how the industrial policies start to take all the other commodities we discussed about fertilizer, helium, other strategic materials more seriously in the context of resilience.
Yeah, and I'd also add one more. Let's keep an eye on the language, because language often tells you when a shift is happening. If the conversation moves from climate ambition to resilience, security, self-reliance, and critical systems, that may be a sign that the politics of clean energy are entering a new phase.
A phase that is probably more based on facts and hard experience.
Yeah, and sadly, global conflicts often force those realizations upon us.
Thank you, Rishi, for the great episode.
Thank you, Carmine. And thanks to all our audience around the world for listening to Sustainability Forward. If you found this episode useful, do share it. And as always, we'd love to hear what you think.